When your sanctuary is under siege by deliberate vandalism, one man's fight to reclaim his home turns into a high-stakes battle against HOA tyranny and corruption. If you love this story, please subscribe to our channel and give us a like to show your support. Josh had always believed that a man's home was his sanctuary, a place of peace, stability, and control in a world that often seemed to spiral out of order. Every morning, as he sipped his coffee and tended to his meticulously trimmed hedge, he felt that deep-rooted sense of pride and security. That illusion came crashing down the morning he stepped outside and found his beloved hedge utterly flattened. Once vibrant and meticulously nurtured, the branches lay twisted and broken, the lush leaves crushed into a tangled mess. Deep tire marks marred the soil, the very soil he'd labored over for countless hours, suggesting that someone had deliberately driven through it without a second thought. Josh clenched his fists as he stared at the devastation, his heart hammering in his chest. "This isn't an accident," he muttered under his breath, voice rough with disbelief and rising anger. He had seen tire tracks before, remnants of a previous owner's careless use, but this was different. This was deliberate, and it stung all the more because it wasn't random. It was personal. At first, he considered the possibility of a reckless driver or a delivery truck making a wrong turn, but a small, shattered fragment of plastic, a piece of a headlight casing, was all too familiar. It screamed one name, Karen Douglas. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, had already badgered him about his hedge. She claimed it was too tall, too wild, and not in line with her vision of a perfect neighborhood. But to Josh, that hedge was far more than mere decoration. It was a boundary, a statement of his rights over his own property. Determined to get answers, Josh grabbed his phone and dialed Karen's number. He marched over to her door with a folder of evidence tucked under his arm. When Karen answered, her tone was as icy as ever. "Karen, we need to talk. My hedge, it's been destroyed again. This isn't some careless accident. I know what's happening here," Josh said, his voice low and steady but laced with fury. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she crossed her arms. "Josh, maybe you're overreacting. Sometimes nature takes its course. Perhaps you just didn't maintain it well enough," she replied, her tone dismissive. "Maintain it? Karen, look at it," Josh snapped, gesturing toward the wreckage outside. "These tire tracks aren't from a runaway truck. They're from a high-end SUV, the kind that someone with money and power drives. And that little piece of plastic, it's a dead giveaway. I know you're behind this." There was a tense silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Karen's voice came back, clipped and irritated. "You're jumping to conclusions, Josh. I'm just here to enforce community standards. Your hedge doesn't meet them, and it's time you accepted that." "Accepted? I've lived here for 15 years, Karen. My hedge is my sanctuary, and now you're trying to bulldoze it with your rules. This is more than just aesthetics. It's about my right to control my own property," Josh retorted, his voice rising with each word. "Look, Josh," Karen said, a hint of frustration creeping in, "if you can't keep your property in line, then maybe you shouldn't expect the rest of us to tolerate it. I'm just doing my job." Josh took a deep breath, steadying himself. "My job is to protect my home, not to bow down to your tyrannical demands. I have evidence, Karen. I have footage of that SUV, the tire marks, and even a fragment of your handiwork. This isn't just about a hedge. It's about you and your crooked agenda." For a long moment, nothing was said, and the tension was palpable. Finally, Karen's voice softened slightly, but only to whisper, "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." That was all the confirmation Josh needed. His sanctuary had been violated, and someone had orchestrated this deliberate attack. He knew then that Karen wasn't acting alone. There was a bigger scheme at play, one that threatened not only his hedge but his home and his way of life. With a determined glint in his eyes, Josh turned away from the conversation, already planning his next move. He would gather every shred of evidence, every piece of footage, and every whispered complaint from the neighbors. The battle had just begun, and Josh was ready to fight back, not just to restore his hedge, but to reclaim his sanctuary. After that explosive confrontation, Josh's mind raced with questions. Who could be behind such deliberate destruction? That morning's evidence had shattered the illusion of peace, and now he was determined to uncover the truth. Late that evening, with the memory of the flattened hedge still burning in his eyes, Josh set up additional cameras around his property. He needed irrefutable proof that this wasn't an isolated act of vandalism, but part of a calculated campaign. As midnight approached, Josh sat in his living room, the glow of the security monitor reflecting off his determined face. The footage from previous nights had already revealed a dark silhouette near his hedge, but tonight, he hoped for something clearer. The clock ticked past 12:15 a.m. when he heard the unmistakable hum of an engine in the distance. His pulse quickened. He leaned forward, eyes glued to the screen. There, a black SUV, sleek and ominous, rolled slowly along the perimeter. Its tires left deep, deliberate marks in the soft soil. As it paused near the fence, the vehicle's headlights briefly illuminated a figure moving stealthily in the shadows. Josh's heart pounded as he rewound the footage. The details were grainy, but one thing was clear. The vehicle was no ordinary sedan. Its heavy build and distinctive shape screamed luxury and power. And it wasn't just any intruder. It was the same type of vehicle he'd come to associate with Karen Douglas's world. The next morning, determined to confront the matter head-on, Josh reached out to a few trusted neighbors. He met with Linda, a longtime resident who had always been wary of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, at a quiet corner coffee shop. Over steaming cups of coffee, he laid out his suspicions. "Linda, it's not just my hedge," Josh said in a low, urgent tone. "I've captured footage of a black SUV. Its tire tracks, the way it moves, it's deliberate. And I'm pretty sure it's connected to Karen." Linda's eyes widened. "I've heard whispers before about how Karen and her cohorts sometimes use high-end vehicles to send a message. People say there's a shady developer involved, too. Something about forged permits and pressure on homeowners." "Josh, if you're right, this goes way beyond a simple property dispute." Encouraged by Linda's words, Josh decided to dig deeper. He visited a local auto repair shop known to work with luxury vehicles. The shop owner, a gruff but honest man named Frank, confirmed his suspicions. "I've seen that type of SUV more than once around these parts," Frank said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "It leaves distinct tire patterns, heavy, aggressive. If I had to guess, it's the kind of vehicle used by folks who mean business." Karen's not acting alone. Armed with this new information, Josh began piecing together a larger picture. Late one evening, as he pored over zoning maps and property documents, he discovered a series of irregular permits and suspicious transactions tied to a local developer named Paul Langford, a name that sent a chill down his spine. The documents suggested that Langford, working in cahoots with corrupt city officials, was pushing for new construction projects that would put pressure on homeowners who resisted changing their properties to fit an idealized neighborhood model. And at the center of it all was Karen. "Karen's been using my hedge as a starting point, a symbol of resistance," Josh whispered to himself as he scanned the papers. "If I can expose this connection, it could bring everything crashing down." Determined, he started compiling his evidence meticulously. Every grain of data was logged, every phone call recorded. In between his late-night investigations, Josh would occasionally catch fleeting glimpses of Karen's presence near his property. A figure slipping behind a car, a flash of her familiar features in a passing window. Each time, his resolve hardened. One chilly morning, while rechecking his camera footage, Josh noticed something even more damning. A timestamp showing the black SUV parked for an extended period near his property. And then, just moments later, a shadowy exchange near a parked car that he couldn't quite make out. It was enough to suggest collusion, to hint that Karen wasn't acting on her own. That afternoon, as Josh walked through his now-scarred backyard, he muttered, "They're trying to push me out, but I'm not going down without a fight." The thought reverberated through him like a promise. His sanctuary was under siege, but every piece of evidence he collected was another brick in the wall of his resistance. Determined to expose the conspiracy, Josh drafted a plan. He would compile his evidence and head straight to City Hall. He knew that the crooked permits, the forged documents, and the intimidating actions of Karen and her allies couldn't hide forever under the weight of the law. Tomorrow, he would take his case to the officials, hoping to spark an investigation that would finally dismantle this corrupt network. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over his battered hedge, Josh took a final look at the remnants of his once perfect sanctuary. His heart ached at the loss, but a fierce determination burned brighter. He wasn't just defending his home. He was fighting for the right to live free from tyranny. The weight of evidence had pushed Josh to the brink of no return. With his sanctuary battered by deliberate vandalism and the shadow of corruption looming large, he resolved to expose the sinister network behind Karen Douglas. Every piece of data, from the tire marks and security footage to the forged permits and suspicious transactions linked to Paul Langford, had led him here. Tonight, he would confront the system head-on. In the dim glow of his study, Josh spread out his collected documents on the table. His hands trembled slightly as he reread the irregular permits and suspicious financial records. "This is it," he murmured, determination sharpening his eyes. Every crooked signature and every forged approval, they all point to Langford and his cronies. And Karen, she's just a pawn in their game. Earlier that day, Josh had met with a trusted friend, Linda, at a quiet diner. Over steaming cups of coffee, he laid out his findings. "Linda, look at these figures," he said, tapping a printed spreadsheet. "They're pushing new construction projects through fraudulent permits, and they're doing it quietly without any real oversight. They want to seize control of our neighborhood by forcing homeowners, like me, to comply with their vision." Linda shook her head, her eyes dark with worry. "Josh, if what you say is true, then this isn't just about a destroyed hedge. It's about our entire community's future. We can't let them bully us out of our homes." That conversation had steeled his resolve. Tonight, he decided he would take his evidence to City Hall. With his folder of documents clutched tightly, Josh set out under the cover of twilight. The city lights flickered in the distance as he approached the imposing building, its facade cold and unyielding. Inside City Hall, Josh navigated the sterile corridors with a determined pace. His footsteps echoed as he made his way to the clerk's office. When he finally stood before the receptionist, he didn't waste any time. "I need to file a motion for an emergency hearing regarding fraudulent permits and illegal property seizures in my neighborhood," he stated firmly, placing a thick stack of printed evidence on the counter. The receptionist glanced at the papers and then back at him, eyebrows raised. "What exactly is this about, Mr. Harris?" she asked cautiously. "It's about corruption, plain and simple," Josh replied, voice steady despite the fury burning inside him. "Karen Douglas, the HOA enforcer, has been working with a shady developer, Paul Langford, to force homeowners out of their property by orchestrating acts of vandalism and forging permits. I have clear evidence that my hedge was destroyed deliberately, and the same high-end SUV that left those tire marks belongs to this operation." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly as she scanned the documents. "I'll notify the supervisor," she said, tapping a few keys on her computer. "Please have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." Minutes later, a stern-looking official, Mr. Carter, arrived. "Mr. Harris, I've been informed of your complaint," he said, his tone measured yet inquisitive. "We take allegations of corruption very seriously. Please explain everything." Josh took a deep breath and launched into his story. "I've lived in my home for 15 years, and it's always been my sanctuary. But in the last 2 weeks, I've experienced repeated acts of vandalism. My meticulously maintained hedge has been destroyed, not once but twice. I have security footage showing a high-end SUV deliberately plowing through it. When I investigated further, I discovered irregular permits and forged documents linking these actions to Karen Douglas, the HOA enforcer, and Paul Langford, a local developer known for his shady deals. I believe they're using these tactics to force homeowners like me into submission so they can seize control of our properties." Mr. Carter leaned forward, his interest piqued. "And you have physical evidence?" "Every single detail is documented," Josh insisted, opening his folder to reveal time-stamped photos, copies of permits, and video stills showing the SUV's tire tracks. I've even cross-referenced the license plate with local records, and it all adds up. This isn't random vandalism. It's a coordinated effort. Mr. Carter exchanged a glance with a colleague who had been listening silently from the door. This is serious, Mr. Harris. I'll have to escalate this to the city's investigative unit. I assure you, we will look into these claims thoroughly. Josh nodded, a mix of relief and determination flooding through him. Thank you, sir. I need this exposed, not just for my home, but for everyone in our community who's being bullied by these crooked practices. As he left City Hall later that day, a sense of cautious optimism stirred within him. The wheels of justice had been set in motion. Outside, the cool evening air did little to ease the tension in his chest, but Josh knew that exposing the conspiracy was only the first step. With the evidence now in the hands of city officials, the next phase of the battle was about to begin, a phase that would challenge the corrupt forces head-on. And Josh, with his sanctuary already scarred but his spirit unbroken, was ready to fight back. The days following his meeting at City Hall were a whirlwind of anxious anticipation and covert preparations. Josh's case had caught the attention of city officials, and while he wasn't sure how quickly an investigation would move, he knew that every moment counted. At night, he double-checked his security cameras and backed up every shred of evidence he'd gathered, determined that nothing would be lost. One brisk morning, as Josh walked through his yard, a space still scarred by the destruction of his once-perfect hedge, he received an unexpected call from Linda. "Josh, I just heard from a neighbor. Someone's been posting flyers around the neighborhood claiming that your property is in violation of zoning laws," she said, her voice a mix of concern and urgency. "They're trying to paint you as the bad guy in this whole mess." Josh's eyes narrowed. That sounds like another diversion tactic. If they can convince the community that I'm breaking rules, it makes it easier for Langford and Karen to push through their plan. I need to counter that narrative with facts. Determined to stay one step ahead, Josh arranged a discreet meeting with a few like-minded residents at a local diner. There, over hurried cups of coffee and low whispers, Linda, Derek, and Maria shared their own stories of HOA overreach. "I've been harassed about my landscaping," Maria confessed, shaking her head. "They even sent me a notice about unsightly flower beds. It's like they want us all to conform to their bland idea of perfection." Derek leaned in, his voice resolute. "We need to band together. This isn't just about your hedge, Josh. It's about every single homeowner who's being bullied out of their property. We have evidence, and we have the truth on our side. Let's coordinate our efforts. We'll share our documentation, and I'll connect you with an attorney who specializes in fighting corrupt property schemes." Fueled by solidarity, Josh spent the next several days compiling a comprehensive dossier. He collected statements from neighbors, high-resolution photos of the vandalism and forged documents, and even audio recordings of heated confrontations. Every piece of evidence was meticulously cataloged. With this trove of information, he planned to confront not only the local officials, but also the press, exposing the entire web of corruption orchestrated by Karen and her cohorts. Late one evening, as dusk gave way to darkness, Josh's phone buzzed with an alert. One of his security cameras had caught something alarming. A black SUV, similar to the one in the earlier footage, was parked across the street near a nondescript building. The timestamp showed it was there just minutes before. His heart pounded as he replayed the footage. In the brief glimpse, a figure in a tailored suit could be seen exiting the vehicle and disappearing into the building. Josh's mind raced. This had to be linked to Paul Langford, the shady developer he'd uncovered. The next morning, with his dossier clutched tightly under his arm, Josh drove to a local neighborhood association meeting that was already in chaos. Rumors of his evidence had spread, and the atmosphere was electric with anger and uncertainty. As he entered the community hall, murmurs filled the room, and all eyes turned toward him. He stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady as he began. "Fellow residents, what you've heard is true. There is a web of corruption affecting our community. My home was attacked, not just by random vandals, but by those who seek to force us out by intimidating and controlling every aspect of our property. A hush fell over the crowd as he laid out the evidence. Photos, video clips, and documents that detailed fraudulent permits and shady financial transactions. This isn't merely about aesthetics or minor infractions. It's about an orchestrated effort led by Karen Douglas and backed by influential figures like Paul Langford to seize control of our neighborhood for their gain. Voices of support erupted. Linda, her eyes filled with determination, added, "We've all been pushed too far. It's time we stand up and fight for our rights, for our homes." Derek and Maria echoed her sentiment, calling for unity and demanding that the HOA board be held accountable. Amid the clamor, a stern official from the city council arrived to speak, his tone formal yet tinged with urgency. "We have received your evidence, Mr. Harris, and we are opening a formal investigation into these claims. I urge all residents to remain vigilant and report any further incidents." Josh felt a surge of hope, but also knew the battle was far from over. As he left the meeting, the weight of the evidence in his hands and the resolve in his heart, he realized that the true fight had just begun. The corrupt network was unraveling, and every person in the community had a role to play in exposing the truth. The tension that had been simmering for weeks finally reached a boiling point. With his dossier of evidence in hand and his community rallying behind him, Josh knew that the time had come to deliver the decisive blow. The investigation by City Hall had gathered momentum, and whispers of corruption were echoing throughout the neighborhood. Now it was time to confront the enemy head-on. One chilly morning, as gray clouds drifted across the sky, Josh made his way back to City Hall. The imposing building loomed before him, a symbol of authority now under scrutiny. He clutched his folder tightly, the weight of every documented injustice pressing down on him. Inside, he was ushered into a conference room where several city council members and law enforcement officials had assembled. Their eyes were fixed on him, a mix of determination and anticipation in the room. "Mr. Harris," began Councilman Rodriguez, his voice measured and firm, "we have reviewed your evidence. The claims you've brought forward regarding forged permits, unauthorized property seizures, and the involvement of local developer Paul Langford are serious. Today, we are here to hold accountable those who have exploited our community." Josh's heart pounded as he stepped forward, laying out his evidence one final time. "I'm not just fighting for my home," he declared, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I'm fighting for every homeowner who has been bullied out of their sanctuary by an abuse of power. Karen Douglas and her cohorts have tried to force us into submission through intimidation and deceit. This evidence shows their collusion with Langford and even corrupt officials, all to seize control of our properties." A murmur ran through the room as officials exchanged glances. Councilman Rodriguez continued, "Based on the evidence provided, we are initiating a formal investigation into these allegations. Officers will be dispatched to execute search warrants at the residences and offices of those involved, and we are coordinating with state authorities to ensure that every illegal act is thoroughly examined." Outside City Hall, the news spread like wildfire. Neighbors, once fearful of retaliation, gathered in small clusters, their expressions a mixture of relief and defiant hope. Meanwhile, Josh received a call from Linda, who sounded both excited and anxious. "Josh, the police have made several arrests today," she said. "I just heard that Paul Langford has been taken into custody, and Karen Douglas has been suspended pending further investigation. This is our turning point." Josh allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, though he knew the fight wasn't over yet. He spent the remainder of the day giving statements to investigators, supplying every scrap of evidence he had meticulously gathered. Every time-stamped photo, every grainy video clip, every piece of forged paperwork was scrutinized. By the end of the day, the city's investigative unit had enough to mount a full-scale crackdown on the corrupt network. That evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, Josh stood on his porch surveying his property. The scars of vandalism were still visible, the flattened hedge a painful reminder of the battle. But now, those scars symbolized resistance and resilience. In a final, quiet moment, he whispered to himself, "This is my home, and I will always protect it." Across town, news outlets began broadcasting the story. Headlines blared, corruption exposed, developer, HOA enforcer arrested in homeowner bullying scandal. The community, once intimidated by unchecked power, now celebrated a victory that extended far beyond a single property dispute. The corrupt network had been dismantled and justice had been served. Later that night, as neighbors gathered for a modest celebration, Linda raised a toast. "Here's to standing up for our rights and reclaiming our sanctuaries," she proclaimed. The crowd cheered, and Josh couldn't help but smile. Though his hedge was gone, something far more important had been restored: a sense of community, empowerment, and hope. If you believe in fighting back against injustice and standing up for your rights, remember that no one should be bullied out of their sanctuary. Every act of defiance can spark change, and together, we can expose corruption and reclaim our freedom. Subscribe to our channel and hit like to support more real-life stories of courage and resilience. Stay vigilant, stand united, and never let tyranny win.